good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure people are going to be signing in as we get going, but we're going to start. I am Liza Bernard from the Norman Williams Public Library here in Woodstock, Vermont. And while the library is open regular hours for patrons to visit, we also offer curbside service pickup in the foyer for those who want to limit their contact at this point in time with COVID. And we have moved most events to this online platform, which has its advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are we have a guest from Arizona. The disadvantages, we aren't in person and there's not the audience author interaction that is so special to all of us. Now, before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and the panelists will be on the screen, and for the sake of clarity, the audience will remain muted. We invite you to put your comments and questions in the chat box, and there you'll find the list of books, and the Yankee Bookshop has generously offered to donate a portion of the proceeds to the Norman Williams Library. And of course, as I mentioned, the library will have copies to lend, of course. Format this afternoon is pretty straightforward. I will do very brief introductions, and then our guests will have the platform. And then towards the end, we're going to open up to questions which you may pose by typing into the chat. Our two guests are both authors who have written well-received historical novels. That's sort of going to be the theme. Jillian Cantor, who has agreed to interview Melodie, has a BA in English from the Penn State University and an MFA from the University of Arizona. Born and raised in a suburb of Philadelphia, Jillian currently lives in Arizona, where it is actually warm, with her husband and 2 sons. Jillian has published 11 well-received novels for teens and adults, including Beautiful Little Fools, that is now to be released on February 1st. It has already been declared an Indie Next pick for January by independent booksellers, who, for those of you in the audience who know me, that's my world. That's near and dear to my heart, having spent 30 years in an independent bookstore. Her books have been translated into 13 languages and pitched to her publisher as Big Little Lies meets The Great Gatsby. Beautiful Little Fools is a reimagining of the classic novel that delves into the women's stories told in their alternating points of view and taking place before, during, and after the original novel, as a detective investigates the 3 women whose lives were entangled with Jay Gatsby's. Fiona Davis, who's a New York Times bestselling author of The Lines of Fifth Avenue, said of Beautiful Little Fools, quote, Jillian Cantor's shifting telescope of female perspectives makes F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic tale of jazz age, longing and lust feel utterly modern, a breathtaking accomplishment. That was better said than I could have done. She'll be speaking with Melodie Winawer, who is a physician scientist and associate professor of neurology at Columbia. Are you still?
I am still. That's one of my problems since I live here.
She has published over 50 articles and contributed to several anthologies. Melodie lives with her spouse and their 3 children in Ludlow, Vermont. Anticipation, her new novel, which I'm supposed to have in my hand and I left downstairs.
I have it.
Was published in France. It's Melodie's second novel, following The Scribe of Siena, which was translated into German, Czech, Polish, and Norwegian to critical acclaim. Anticipation is set in the ancient Greek city of Bistris. I didn't pronounce that right, but she can correct us, and spans nearly 9 centuries. It involves a newly widowed scientist who takes a much needed vacation with her young son, and she meets an intriguing tour guide whose story is much, much more complicated than it would first seem. It turns out he was originally born in 1237. The same reviewer who reviewed Jillian's book wrote of Melodie's book that it's a sweeping saga spanning multiple centuries. Anticipation enthralled me with its scope. Yet Winawer's gift as a writer also shines brightly in the small moments, like the shared joy between a mother and a child, or the meditations on loss of a grieving widow. Truly magical, and I agree. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to Melodie.
Thank you so much, Liza. Thanks to the Norman Williams Public Library in Vermont and the Yankee Bookshop, also for Woodstock, Vermont, for making this event possible and bringing us together to talk about books. Even though this event is virtual, it is based in Woodstock, Vermont, and that is where my heart is at this moment, even though I'm in Ludlow, which is about 45 minutes on 3 highways away. I've driven that often since my kids go to school there, and we were a member of the synagogue in Woodstock. I wanted to just say that there's an amazing kind of coincidence in the publishing of this book and my moving to Vermont, which was in October of 2020. I had just finished Anticipation. We had spent 4 days traveling 5 counties and 1,300 miles looking for a house and found it. At the same time, I was on the phone with my agent trying to finalize changes to the manuscript of Anticipation, and during which time, of course, because it's Vermont, I lost cell service multiple times. So I was not driving, though, if those of you are worried about that. So this juxtaposition of those two things means that my welcoming committee for Vermont was bookstores and libraries. And that's an extraordinary welcoming committee here. Every tiny town has a bookstore, some have more than one, and the community of readers and of bookish people is incredible, and I've been privileged to join it. So, of course, when we first scheduled this event, we hoped it was in person, but I think the pandemic has taught us a good life lesson, which I keep trying to learn, which is how do you turn disappointment into opportunity? And in this particular case, that meant I could invite an author from anywhere to join me. And I immediately thought of Jillian Cantor, whom I met in 2018 in Tucson. And I don't think she would have traveled 2,574 miles to join me tonight, nor be willing to drop a temperature difference of 70 degrees.
Yeah, probably not.
Because there's a reason you don't live here. It was -8 last week, this weekend. And so Jillian maybe remembers that she's responsible for convincing me to agree to let my publisher see and purchase in advance of finishing it this novel. I had written 130 pages and they said, can you show it to us? We'd be interested in acquiring it before it's finished with a contract to complete it. And I was totally terrified. And she said, why aren't you doing this? And I said, oh, okay. And then I did. And I finished it then in 18 months, which was a horrible experience for my family, but it's why this book is where it is. And I'm very grateful actually for that little push from a multi-book author to make me understand that it was foolish of me to say no. I also credit her with taking me to a wonderful restaurant where I had my first and my second margarita of my life.
Right. I forgot about
yes.
that.
And I learned that margaritas make me talk very, very fast. And I'm really sorry. I never apologized.
I don't remember that.
For that. I mean, I was like, I could hear myself accelerating. And I said, you really have to slow down, but you can't. So in any case, this event is dedicated to the community of Woodstock and Vermont, and also to Jillian for helping me get Anticipation out of my head and into readers' hands. So thank you, Jillian, for coming tonight.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. And, I remember the margarita, and I like, now that you say it, I think I vaguely remember this conversation, but I don't remember that I pushed you to do it. I remember you were talking about it. So it must have been one of those things that settled more with you than with me, but I'm so happy that you did and that you finished the book and that it gave you the push to do it.
Yeah.
And also, I have to say, as we were kind of just talking about a little bit before, I've already launched one book during the pandemic in early 2021. So I've done a lot of virtual events, and definitely the upside is being able to connect with people that you wouldn't be able to when you launch your book because of the cost and the time and the weather and the travel. So thank you for asking me to do this. So why don't you just tell us a little bit, first of all, about where your inspiration and idea came for this book? Because like you said, you had 130 pages, but you hadn't shown it to your publisher yet. So what made you get to those 130 pages?
Yeah. So at the time that I started to conceive of this book, I had just finished The Scribe of Siena, and everybody told me I should be celebrating, but I was actually totally traumatized because I wanted to be writing and I wasn't. And so I immediately wanted to write another book.
That's very healthy of you.
Yeah, I was like, I can't stand it. So my friends were like, oh, to go out and celebrate. I said, I'm in mourning. I want to be in that story. So At that exact moment, as things often happen, I was working as a doctor that day in the Neurological Institute, and I was also contemplating where I should take our family on vacation, if I ever could have a vacation. And I took a break, which rarely happens, and I ran into my colleague, Michael Darris, to whom this book is actually dedicated, who's a Greek-American neurologist with whom I've worked for 25 years. And he said, I said, I've been to Greece many times and I love it very much, but I've never taken my kids there. And he said, oh, and he walked into my office and he starts drawing on the back of a manila envelope, you should go to Mistras. And he starts drawing a map. And I said, what's Mistras? I'd never heard of it before. And he said, oh, it's an abandoned city in the Peloponnesus in southern Greece. And I said, an abandoned city? Why? And then my wheels started turning and we talked for a while and I kept that manila envelope, which I recently found. And then I put it away. Oops, excuse me. And I didn't think about it for a while. I went, back on the train after seeing a million patients. And then a few months later, I was clearing out the storeroom in our house because we were about to prepare for the yard sale. And there was a whole bunch of books in the attic that we'd inherited from the previous owners that they couldn't move. And in that attic, I found a book that I'd never seen before with a cover I couldn't read. And I opened it and it was called Castles of the Morea, which is that part of Greece, the Peloponnesus. And I opened it and it opened to a page entitled The Castle of Vistras. So having never heard of it before at all until that moment, and then hearing about it twice in this very mysterious way, I said, okay, clearly this is a place I need to know more about. It's a mysterious place that disappeared for reasons I don't know, and I want to know more about it. And so we went there as a family in 2015, and it was even more magical than I had imagined. The entire place, it's a ruined medieval city that was built in the 1200s, but it was the capital of the Byzantine Empire at the end after Constantinople fell and was in existence for 800 years. The last residents moved out in 1953. So it is now a historic landmark. There is actually one monastery where nuns still live and practice in the middle of these ruins on a strange conical hill in Greece. And so that place, I wanted so badly to repopulate it, to understand its history, but to have it be alive, not just to read history, but to have real people in it and to feel it humming again. And that's where this book came from.
So when you went, you didn't know you were going to write about it before you got there.
Well, I had, at that point, I was already kind of feeling like it was someplace that I might write about. So I visited it with this very intense kind of purpose, which meant that at that point, too, pretty young, this was 2015, and it was right after the referendum. So right after Greece had to vote whether or not to accept these very strict and horrible economic austerity measures from the Eurozone. And they voted no. That sort of became part of the story, this sort of juxtaposition of Greece's current economic struggle, which I felt firsthand because I have a lot of friends there who are really suffering and not able to feed their families and not able to pay their electricity bills. And they, there were so many years of history that kind of went into that. And I felt, as you often do too, I think this feeling of the past and the present kind of colliding at that moment in this ruined city. Which I dragged my kids around for 6.5 hours.
I mean, there are worse places they could be dragged around.
True, so. They were pretty into it, I have to say. And so, but I think fortunately it was December, not July, where I set this book because it's very, very hot in July to be walking up and down a really steep mountain. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I don't often get to travel where I set my books. And so I love that you went there and you had these sort of coincidental two things that came together before you went there. And then the book came from that. And then your main character, she's also a scientist and a mother. And I read in your author's note, it was like your love of history, being a mother, being a scientist, all converged in this book. So aside from the setting, how did her story start for you?
Yeah. So I think I'm very moved by and I personally connect with how loss kind of sets change in motion. I have a lot of personal experience of that, in my own life, about how transformation sometimes, even positive transformation can arise out of great loss. And I also experience it a lot with my patients. I see a lot of the ends of things. And so that was part of what moved me to write the story of a woman whose life is transformed really at the moment at which she loses her husband. But I was also really compelled, and I don't think I had I don't know if it's guts. Like I didn't feel like I could take on parenting in my first novel. I wasn't ready. And this time I was ready. And so for me, the relationship that Helen, this woman scientist, modern New York scientist, parallels are perhaps obvious, except she's not really me. People ask that question all the time. But the relationship she has with her son, Alexander, after the death of his father and her husband, brought up also the way in which relationships struggle in the setting of a shared loss. And people may grieve differently, but also they have to reconfigure who they are to each other when they've lost this third person.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of the motivation for their psychology. But also I think kids often drive things. We think we're controlling them, but really we're not. Parenting is a little bit more like getting on a boat and then you just have to follow the water wherever it takes you. And often it is not at all where you anticipated going. And so the fact that he sends
want to go.
Right. And then you find out later, for example, it's why I'm downhill skiing now, which I took up at 53. Of course, I live 7 minutes from Okemo Mountain, but it's because my kids were out there and I was so envious. And they said, come on, Mom. I mean, I had done it at 15 and then said, no, that's enough. I'm not doing that. And now I'm, doing it. So thank you. I just hope something bad doesn't happen. Right now, I'm really exhilarated. But, so I think that his desire to go to Greece and his knowledge and his love, the way kids sort of, I think genuinely, their interest in things teaches you stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things I've really learned about parenting is how much you can learn from your kids, either because they're learning it or because they're interested and you have to learn it, or because you go somewhere that you wouldn't have gone. And I think finally, something else that really came up in the relationship is parenting is so. This word is totally overused. It is so humbling. You just feel like such an idiot so much of the time, like you're doing everything wrong. And in a way they're ruthless children, but they're also incredibly forgiving. And I think that a lot of this struggle that is very acute right now for parenting in the pandemic of how do you give your kids freedom when you're afraid for their safety? How do you let them go, which is an impossible task of parenting anyway, when the world is a dangerous place? And how do you balance those two things is a big part of this book as well.
Yeah, I found that so relatable as a mom. I mean, I'm not a scientist and I don't know that much about Greece, but I found the mothering aspects just so universal and relatable and just loved that was in there. Loved it. So tell us, okay, so you had 130 pages and then you sold the book. So tell us, and then you said it was something like a horrible 18 months for the family.
Well, it wasn't exactly horrible.
Tell us what the challenges were of writing the book at that point.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I was willing to sell the book at that point because it had gotten to this point that I think a lot of writers talk about where the story goes from being, is this ever going to be anything, to it is. Mm-hmm. And there's a reality moment where it is going to happen. And I think that the challenge for me to begin with, I mean, fortunately, I had written a book and I knew what happened after that. Is this going to be a book? And then it becomes a book. So I knew that was possible. Yeah. And I also knew that every time that I stopped writing, I started again. So, I think that writing into the abyss, which is what I call the first draft, is sort of terrifying because you just have to you really do throw yourself off a cliff and hope that you land. I think that's also really exhilarating. It's a little bit like downhill skiing, except maybe you have a little bit more control. I don't know. Ideally, I think both are very tightly controlled, but so there is that exhilarating free fall, but the challenge was at that moment is that I have a full-time job. So I'm a doctor and a scientist. I have National Institutes of Health funded grants, 3 kids, very, very extremely, extremely busy. And one problem I had was logistics. Like, how do you fit finishing a novel in 18 months that the first draft was going to be 780 pages, which it was, because I just could feel it coming, and it was a disaster that it was that long.
I remember you telling me about that.
Yeah, I mean, both of my first drafts were in the 700s, and both of the books ended up in the 400s. And I write long, and I knew that was going to be okay, and I had to do it anyway. But I think one of the real challenges was that I did not know at that point that I could work sort of in a professional way, forcing myself on deadline to create something that didn't exist.
Mhm.
And that was, I think that's the biggest challenge of all, is I didn't know whether I could harness that. And in
Yeah.
fact, especially since I wrote The Scribe of Siena, my first book, almost entirely on the subway, um, it had this kind of, I didn't know how to sit down at a desk and write. On the other hand, I produce huge amounts of written material at high speed in my work, my
Yeah,
science,
but it's
right? So,
different because it's not this like creative
right.
thing.
I just
Yeah.
said, if it's magic, how am I going to be sure that I can wave the wand and make it happen?
Yeah.
But it turns out it's not magic. Some aspects of, you know this very well, having done it 11 times, but people I've talked to who keep doing it over and over again say there is always that, oh God, how is this going to even happen? And then it does. And there's that aspect. But then when I actually did sit down at my desk and write, I said today, there was one day kind of early on in the process, I said, I'm going to sit down at my desk and I'm going to write fiction. And it sounds really silly, but the moment I did it was so remarkable that I called, because wasn't sure it was possible, that I actually called my mother and said, I wrote at my desk. I know this is very silly sounding, but I didn't write on the subway. Like I wrote in a sort of an official way. And I think one of the reasons that I said yes was that I knew it would make me write it fast. And I wanted to write it fast. I wanted to have a carved out, to have it be my job, actually. I wanted to give it the professional grace of being something that, that had as much weight as the other things I was doing. And of course, that's hard because I do work full time. And fortunately, my chair was very supportive, of my writing. And so I was able to, he said, if you need time for your writing, you let me know. I understand. Not that I took any off, really, which is awful. That was the hard part. And so just to sort of come full circle with that story, when we were at a party in the days when there were still parties, and I had finished the manuscript, someone came up to me and my spouse and said, so what's it like being married to someone who has to finish a novel on deadline? And she just walked away. I'm sorry. We can't have this conversation.
Wasn't the right time to ask that question.
So anyway, it's done. My kids, my whole family was very supportive, but I was a little tense.
Yeah. So you had 720 pages, and I remember, I think we met for dinner when you had like 500 at that point, I think. And you were telling me that it was going to be really long. So how did you get from 720 pages, and what was your revision process like? So and you knew your first draft was going to be long. So how did you?
Yeah.
I feel like I would look at 720 pages and be extremely overwhelmed.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, I feel like editing it's a different challenge for sure. Getting the first thing out is in some ways the most frightening. The editing is very, very difficult, but it's a different kind of difficult. I think the essence is, I was fortunate in that because I sold it before it was done, I had an editor ready to take it.
Right, so you had help.
Right. So it was a little different than Scribe, where I did it myself and then I worked with an outside editor and then, I revised before submission. This was, she said, I'll read your first draft, which is a terrifying thing to do, actually. And of course, she found many horrible things to change. They weren't horrible, but I had to do horrible work.
Yeah.
And some of it was adding. So that was a really hard thing, is that actually one of the last chapters or sections, which is in the entire section on the War of Independence, which is a century I had never written about, was not written when I finished the first draft. And so I had to add that and also subtract.
And no, you had to cut.
Yeah. So, but I think cutting is this interesting experience of some of it you have to give up things you really love, but I think that's necessary. Especially in historical fiction, where there is this dangerous tendency to put in all this stuff that you think is really cool that and that's not necessarily good for the story. Yeah. So some of it
I think in any fiction that happens.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, where you just have to decide, I like this, or I thought I liked this, but it's not, it doesn't need to be there. And I think that's what the editing process is like. Often it's in rereading that I'm able to say, okay, I'm bored. So for sure, someone else is going to be bored.
Yeah.
And sometimes two characters will become one, or it's up, or so there's an entire scene that when it's subtracted isn't missed. And that's kind of interesting in that, I think the ideal is to get the book down to this very, very dense version of what it was original, but nothing is really gone. And And so that's the perfect vision of editing. And I kind of like the slash and burn now, the tearing it apart and throwing things out. It's satisfying, and I like to see it shrink. And it reminds me a little bit of when I saw the Mark Rothko painting exhibit at MoMA in the days when, well, museums are back, but and I remember seeing them and being totally transfixed by these paintings, which are enormous, enormous, enormous abstracts with those sort of blurred stripes. And I learned reading about it afterwards that even though they're incredibly large, he painted them with very, very, very bright light so that all kinds of detail would be there that wouldn't be seen by the viewer later. And I think that an edited manuscript is like that. The book, there's lots of stuff that's gone that the reader can't see, but the fact that it was once there or that it's invisible but there makes the book deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And I just write the back. I guess I write all of it and then I take it out, but it's still there. And so it makes me feel like it's a little less hard to get rid of it because I know it's there and it makes the story deep.
So you're writing that first draft for yourself in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And then
I just have to do it.
the second draft, yeah, for the people reading. That's really interesting.
Yeah. What is your process like? Are you closer to the end when you finish the first draft?
I mean, I've never written a 720-page draft. I can definitely say that. And it depends on the book. Beautiful Little Fools. I normally don't outline. Did you outline?
I hate outlines. I can't do it.
Yeah, so I hate outlining too, but I did outline Beautiful Little Fools because it's a reimagining of The Great Gatsby, and there's a lot of like scenes and the timeline from Gatsby. So I didn't want to get anything wrong. So I outlined the whole book and then totally stuck to the outline, shocking myself. And so it was like the outline and the first draft and the final draft are remarkably similar, except for the last chapter, which wasn't in my outline.
I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, no, I won't tell you. No spoilers, but the last chapter in the book was not in my outline, was not in my first draft. My editor read my first draft and she was like, the book doesn't have an ending. And I think I argued with her because I was like, no, that's how it ends in my outline. That's the ending. And she was like, no, that's not the ending. So then I had to like take a step back and realize she was right and write the last chapter. But that's the only book that I've ever written that way, that I've ever outlined. And the book I'm working on now, I didn't outline. So it's not like I changed my ways. It was just this specific book.
I think a lot of us hate outlines. I mean, some people do index cards and,
some people love outlines.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem is that this sort of writing into the abyss, forward moving free fall is kind of antithetical to the outline. Like I have to be just something is happening that isn't really structured like that, except that anticipation is also so structurally complicated.
Yeah.
Not
That's
off-putting.
I was curious if you outlined it.
Yeah. So what I did was I drew a diagram for myself that kind of, because it has a present and a past, and the past is kind of jumping forward in these.
Yeah.
And it goes back and forth between this present and then a little bit farther and then this one. And so I actually just had that was just the diagram for me, so that I knew what I was doing, because I like to link past and present, and I wanted to feel the shape of the book, but otherwise I didn't feel like I could outline it any more than I can describe a scene before I write it.
Yeah, I feel like something, and in general, I always say like, well, outline sort of hampers my creativity, because if I know everything that's going to happen before it happens,
it's no fun.
There's no fun. There's no surprise for me. But I don't know, Beautiful Little Fools was just different for some reason, and it was fun, and it didn't hamper it, but it made the process easier, and I wish I could do that all the time. I just can't.
It's interesting. I mean, Beautiful Little Fools, I think folks had heard at the beginning, which I'm about, I guess, 3/4 of the way through, and it is fantastic, and everyone needs to go out and get it immediately as soon as it's available, because you will love it. Seriously. But the thing that I think is so interesting about it is that you're a historical fiction novelist, but instead of having history as your material, you had a novel as your material, The Great Gatsby. So, and for us, it's a historical novel in that it's set in 1918, and it's definitely evokes time and place very intensely. So I'm curious about how that happened for you. How did you make the decision to do that, and how was that different? How did you use fiction as your facts instead of facts as your facts? How did you decide to reinvent it? What were the struggles you had? And
yeah, I mean, it was definitely a different experience in terms of research. My research was reading The Great Gatsby so many times that I had it memorized and mapping it and, knowing where every character was, in every point of time. And there's a lot of dialogue from the original book that makes its way into my book, but in a different context. And so I had to figure all of that out. So it was a different experience for sure. But also felt similar in one way. And I'm doing this still. I keep accidentally saying like, well, the real Daisy said this. And then it's like, oh, wait, no, she wasn't a real person. It was just like the original Daisy from Gatsby. And then there's my Daisy, who's a slightly different person. So in a way, it felt kind of similar to writing about historical people, just because I've read The Great Gatsby so many times. It's like really one of the most influential books, I think, that I've ever read. And I come back to it again and again. So the characters felt real to me, if that makes any sense.
Well, it makes a lot of sense because I think that's how writing is. I mean, there were many times when, this book, Anticipation, has a lot more real people in it than Scribe of Siena, which doesn't have anybody real in it. And there are special challenges to that, to being true to a real person, but also reinventing them in fiction. But I think even my not real people, my invented people, felt really real to me. And people asked me whether they were real. And it was hard for me to answer that, because in some ways the invented people are the most real to a writer, to a fiction writer, because you're so inside them. And they, I had many, many conversations, not all pleasant, mostly okay, with varying protagonists, who asked me questions or argued with me about things. I try to make them do things and they would laugh at me and say, this is totally absurd. You are so off base. You must not, I would never do that. So I think that process of, imagining a fictional character as real is exactly what a reader does too.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, my last book was about Marie Curie. So I did write about a real person. And I've written several books about real people. And every time I do it, I say, I'm never doing this again, because I feel like it's such a challenge to try to fictionalize a real person, but feel like you're staying true to that person. And I get so stressed about getting all the facts correct and the dialogue and, every little thing. So I feel like I need to have a break after writing about a real person. I mean, I'm sure I will do it again one day, but every time I do it, I tell myself I'm never doing it again. So I felt like this was refreshing in that it was completely fictional. But then in a different way, so many people know The Great Gatsby. So I felt a different kind of stress in having to stay true to the original. So it brought its own challenges, that my other books haven't had. And you have a blend of real people and fictional people, which is my favorite kind of historical fiction, when you can fit your own characters into this sort of real world. So how did you decide, where to do that?
Yeah. So, I think writing historical fiction in general is kind of this experience of having a scaffold of fact that is useful, like for things that happened and, not just big things like battles and plagues and other major events, other natural disasters or, the transfer empires or whatever. And in some ways, I'm not very interested in very big things. I think as a fiction writer, a lot of the joy of the details comes in the little things, like what do people eat for breakfast, and do they call it breakfast, or do they eat breakfast at all, and what do kids wear, and do they drink milk, and how do people think about death, and what about childbirth, and where are people buried, and what do you do for a living, and that sort of thing. That's what makes the things feel real. So you've got all these facts, and that's part of what's fun about historical fiction. And usually you approach some time and place because something interesting has happened that you're interested in, at least as a writer, and hopefully other people will be interested in reading about it. But I think for me, that getting the fiction inside the facts comes because there are gaps. And that is what I do in science also, which is when I am learning about something and I realize there's something that I don't know, I think, okay, do I not know this because I'm ignorant? And then I try to fix that. Or is it because it's not known? And if it's not known, then that's my next project. And I usually, ask experts and read the literature and figure out. And if it's really a mystery and there's nothing there, or it's a controversy, which is also really fun, then that's a perfect place to put if you're a scientist, to put your next, grant.
Yeah.
If you're a historical novelist, it's the absolute perfect place to make stuff up, and that's incredibly
Yeah.
fun. And so I like to find the holes in the facts and put the fiction inside them. And that structure, I mean, I guess, it's sort of like the structure of a very formal poetry form, like sonnets, where you have to follow this form, or Sistine, you have to follow this form, but everything you do inside that form is up to you. And I like that combination of structure and liberty. I did have a lot of apprehension about choosing a real person to be in this book. The first person that I chose was Guillaume Villehardouin, who's this prince who in fact did have very prominent teeth and was really full of himself and liked to read poetry out loud. So I found some fun facts about him, which I was able to fictionalize, but I ended up making him something which I don't know whether it's real. Fortunately, he's not written about very much, and nobody really, there's not a lot of people out there like the Tudor experts who are going to jump down my throat because I did something about Guillaume, but who was this prince of Achaia. He's a French prince in the 13th century who took over a lot of Greece, which, I didn't know anything about this history at all until I got into Anticipation. So, Greece's recurrent history of being occupied by extraordinary number of other places just over and over and over again, which I think shapes the way they feel today. In fact, I spent, right before this book was published, before I finished the manuscript, I spent a summer in the Dodecanese, which are the islands, about 20, the most closest of which is the 20 kilometers from Turkey, which the Ottoman Empire occupied Greece for 400 years. And in Rhodes, which is this island that's 20 kilometers from the Turkish border, some of the old folks who live in Rhodes still call Istanbul Constantinople. They won't change the name to the Turkish name. So there's still things rankle. So when I chose this first person to be real, I remember thinking, can I do this? Do I want to do this? Do I want to go this route of having to actually make someone out of something that already exists? Because I like making people up out of nothing. There are challenges to it, but it's also there's liberty in that, which is kind of, a relief. Having to keep to facts is a little challenging.
Yeah, I agree with that. I love that you approach science and writing in the same way, and that you're kind of searching for the answers that haven't been discovered yet. And I feel that way about writing. I'm not a scientist, but I feel that way about writing too. So that's really fascinating that you do that. So so tell me how you researched this then, because you obviously went to Greece, you were there, but I don't know anything about this time or place. And so what did you do to learn all of this?
So, there are a few different things that I had to learn. And some of it is, came from being in Greece a lot of times and knowing people being close to people who are there. Because so much of what makes this book what it is isn't historical facts. It's the feeling of being Greek. And the feeling of being in Greece if you're not Greek and visiting. And I had a lot of feelings about that because it is one of the most profoundly hospitable, generous places I have ever been. And even when people have absolutely nothing, they give you everything. And I had this experience over and over again. You walk in and all of a sudden you're in the middle of a wedding and you're a guest, basically, or like someone's grandmother is making you breakfast. And it's kind of a constant sense of generosity and welcome. And as I have come to know more and more people in Greece, many of whom I used to help me with this book, many of whom know quite a lot about history, fortunately, including folks at the Anthropological Museum and historians, actually some of whom were in the United States, tour guides who I later called upon, journalists who I met in Mistras who helped me, people who for the audiobook spoke a lot of words into an MP file so that my narrators could learn how to say things in Turkish and Greek and medieval French. So I had a lot of people, but I also, so much of what was important was not just reading volumes and volumes of history, but getting a feel for the place. What is the air like? What does it smell like? I've been to Monemvasia, which is in the book. I've been to Napoleon, which is in the book. I've been to Mistras, which is in the book. I spent a lot of time there. And that was as important as the facts. There's one book that was hugely important to me, which is The Lost, let's see, I'm going to get it actually. 1 second. So I'm back. Hi. The Lost Capital of Byzantium. This book was basically the center of my life for
It looks like it was
several
read
years.
very well.
Yeah, it's complete. It has lots and lots of post-its in it. So this is by Stephen Runciman, who's recently died. It is entirely about Mistas. It's a magical book. It's not fiction, but he has a great love affair with the place and spent a lot of time there, living at the tiny town at the base of the hill where the city once was. And so that was a huge source, but I, read thousands and thousands of pages of really history that, if it's not fictionalized, it would drive you insane. I mean, it nearly did me because everyone has the same name and it's impossible.
I saw that in your author's note. Everyone had the same name and then they went by multiple names. And
yeah, it was just so difficult. But I tried not to make the reader suffer with that. So I just made some simplification choices. So you don't have to do it. I did it.
Yeah. All right, it looks like there's a few questions in the chat. So I'll just read them. Therese asked to me, how would my book be different from fan fiction? So Beautiful Little Fools does have the characters from the original Great Gatsby, but is very much a novel on its own. I don't think if you've read The Great Gatsby, you will definitely get some inside things, but I would say it kind of stands entirely on its own. It's a mystery. Jay Gatsby shot in the beginning, and there's a detective who suspects one of three women did it, and you get to see these women's stories unfold through 1917 to 1923. The Great Gatsby is just set during the summer of 1922. So mine sort of puts them into this whole new world and expands, and definitely gives the women a voice of their own. In the original, the women are very much props. They barely speak. There's a few lines of dialogue. So I think, probably to answer that, you'd have to read it, right?
I mean, having read it myself, I will say that fan fiction I think is more derivative, and yours is very original. I think you used this as a jumping off point.
Yeah, that's a better answer.
To imagine a story, but you wrote your own story.
Yes.
And I think, it's very much a historical fiction action. It just happens to be that the thing you wrote about is a novel.
Yeah. Right. But I think you could read them together. It would be an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
And okay, so Therese asked for you, Melodie, have you had people who reach out to you regarding a possible cure for Huntington's disease? Your main character is a researcher, right? For Huntington's disease.
So no one has done that. I have been collaborating with the Huntington's Disease Society of America. So, I mean, one of the things I had the good fortune, I'm a neurogeneticist, but I don't study Huntington's. So I definitely, this is my universe in a lot of ways. And I think a lot about inheritance and how it, this is where the title came from, which you'll find out as soon as you read the book. And I think a lot about how genetic neurologic diseases affect people and families and their decisions they make about their lives and how they think about the future. But what I have had is just kind of really, I think, really profoundly mutually beneficial collaboration. It hasn't taken fruit necessarily in events, but I just feel like when the Huntington's disease community is not very big, the advocacy community is very intense, not a lot of people write about it. And I wasn't really talking, I guess to some degrees I was talking about cure, but I think more what really resonates with people is the way in which people with neurogenetic diseases can be discriminated against, the way in which genetics makes people scared, the way in which or angry or can be viewed as something dangerous or fearful, and also how to view genetic research with compassion and try not to fall into dangerous temptation. When you see what the possibilities are. So balancing humanity with science is particularly hard in genetics. I spend a lot of time doing that professionally, really understanding how people are suffering. But there have been times when I was taking family histories from multiple individuals and might, for example, find out that someone isn't related to someone in the way they thought they were. That's an interesting experience, which I won't elaborate on. But when you find out that someone isn't the child of the person that they think they are, for example. So genetics has a lot of dangers. I have not been approached for cures. I don't think anyone would imagine that because I wrote a novel, I have any authority on the subject, but it has been really rewarding to work with Huntington's disease professionals that I work with at Columbia, because there's a Center for Excellence for HD, and I spent a long time with a genetic counselor who spends a lot of time talking with families, and that was some of the most useful information I got.
You definitely had sort of like the resources to get the research you needed on that. It was kind of like in your world, but on the periphery a little bit,
Right.
It sounds like. Yeah.
I didn't want to be too close. I mean, I study epilepsy genetics, and I don't think I could ever write a novel about that. It's just, I would bore myself to death.
Yeah. Well, you have to like separate your two lives, I think.
Somewhat, yes.
Yeah. So Miriam said, love your books. What's next? So I was actually going to ask you that too. What are you working on next?
Well, I will show you what I'm working on. I don't know, this is not my screen, so it's a little bit hard, but this is what I'm working on. So this is, can you see this? Let's see, hang on. There we go. So I am working on Minoan Crete. So this is horribly impossible. I seem to do things that just challenge me to the point of near impossibility, just as a routine in life. But this we're now going back to 1400 BC, which is like a whole new universe of difficulty, to Minoan culture. And we're staying in Greece in theory, right? Because this is Crete I'm talking about, but Crete was not Greece, and the time period I'm writing about wasn't a Greek community. And what I'm really interested right now that is becoming a novel is the language, Linear A, which is as yet undeciphered. So I won't say much more about that, except to say that Linear B, which was deciphered, famously was the person who was working on Linear A after deciphering Linear B died in a car crash very young. So I feel like I'm in this really fun position to once again have a mystery that's unsolved and figure out how that becomes fiction. I'm actually spend a lot of time wearing this, maybe as inspiration, the Festos disc, which is, let's see if I can show it to you. So this is a reproduction, this one here, of a disc that was found in one of the tombs in Crete that has the hieroglyphs on it that nobody has been able to translate. So I think about that a lot. I think lost languages are really fascinating, and the process by which, by which we come to understand language is totally fascinating and mysterious anyway. And so that's my next universe.
So you're in the researching stage.
Yeah, although, I can't really help. For me, researching stage and writing stage are really intertwined.
Oh, so you're writing too?
Well, I mean, mostly what's happening, because I'm trying not to write, because I'm writing multiple grants and also trying to finish, pay attention to this book, but it's inevitable. It started a long time ago. I went to Crete actually quite a few years ago now, and it just came at me, and I said, you really must be quiet, because I'm writing a different book. I was still writing dissertation, and it keeps doing that. So it sort of shoves itself in my face, and so it just comes anyway, and I have to do something about it. And I try to sort of store that. But what happens is I kind of read a lot of facts and populate the world, but the fiction is coming at the same time. And then another book that's interfering right now, as I've moved to Vermont, is a Vermont historical novel. You're constantly walking through deserted cemeteries. In fact, I had a school carpool pickup at dusk in a completely deserted cemetery in a ghost town, literally, with owls flying overhead. And I said, you just cannot make this stuff up. This is so terrifying. I really, really hope I'm in the right place. There's no cell service. It's typical of Vermont. So, there's a
book right there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are these moments. I mean, I think basically that's how I get inspiration, is there are these moments, it's very brief usually, where something is going on that has a big emotional content, and it just turns into a novel.
Yeah. Okay, if anyone has any other questions, I'll peek at the chat. And then in the meantime, I'll ask you what your advice would be for aspiring writers. I mean, I think what I find so inspiring from what you do is that you have a full-time job. You are also have 3 teenagers, and you wrote this book under deadline. I mean, I write full-time, so that is my full-time job. So what is your advice maybe to aspiring writers who are doing something else right now but want to write a book?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to love what you're writing about. You have to just really want to spend an extremely long time with it, and not choose it because someone tells you it's popular or would sell, or don't listen to people tell you it's too long or too short, or you can't write a book about that, no one will want it, or you can't do any of those things. All you can do is write the story that is compelling you, that is coming from your whatever inside thing, heart, whatever you call it, where you have to have this story and you have to want it, basically, and you have to love it, because you're going to spend a lot of time with it and you're going to end up hating it periodically anyway, so you might as well start out positive. The question of, efficiency of time, I actually have no idea how to answer that question, except to say that the best way to write a book is to actually physically make yourself write. And thinking about when you have time, you'll write a book, or if things get easier, I'll write a book, or maybe after this happens, I'll write a book, then you will not write a book.
Yeah.
Because a book can't be, you can't clear your life of everything to write a book. Even full-time writers can't do that.
I call that advice butt in chair. That's my
just like, it's just structural. Like, you just have to sit down and just do the thing.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, you have to just get words on the page, and you have to not, I would also highly recommend, although everybody's different, that you not edit as you write, that you just put it down, just get the stuff down, and you will figure it out later. Just make sure you're writing, and then at least you will have written, and then you can figure it out later. And I think the only thing that will assure that you do not get it done is if you give up. And everything else is up to you. So it doesn't have to be brilliant. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be right. It doesn't have to be what you wanted to write. It has to be something. And then you'll figure it out. So that kind of lack of self-censorship, I think, is crucial to getting a book onto the page.
Yeah. Cynthia asked, when you have those moments when the idea comes to you, do you write it down or just let it simmer inside of you until it bubbles up to the top?
Right. So it's a combination between, I need to write this down because I'm not sure I'm going to remember the way I said it or thought it.
Yeah.
And I've had it a few times, but it also, sometimes I think it's important not to write things down, because they develop when you're not writing them down. Sometimes I'll repeat it over and over in my head instead. And when I do a lot of yoga, and I've done yoga 6 days a week for about 22 years. And so sometimes I'll get ideas while I'm in practice, and I can't write them down, and I just sort of repeat them over and over again. And sometimes I think if you put something down too soon, it will, like an outline, destroy the creative process. So it's a combination of the two things.
I have lots of notes in the notes app on my phone.
Yeah, right.
Anytime I'm somewhere, like if I were in that cemetery, which I've never actually had that experience, but if I were, I'd pull out my phone and be like, cemetery, owls, carpool. And then I'll find the note 6 months later and be like, what was I talking about?
I do a lot of that
on my phone, but I feel like, I'll jot them down, and then it's the ones that I'm still thinking about that I didn't really have to write down.
Right, exactly. They rise to the surface anyway. I think often what happens with me is sometimes it's an idea, but often it's a sentence, or I'll hear someone speaking, or there will be a whole conversation. And if it's that, I have to write that down, because I don't want to lose that window into this conversation that's going on. That, like a fictional conversation that I'm hearing the whole thing, and I say, and I won't tell you what it is, but this is my next book. I have this entire conversation, which seems like it might be going on at the beginning of the book, and I was on a walk, and all of a sudden I was hearing this conversation. I said, oh my God. And I did, in fact, take out my phone and speak into it. And of course it was so garbled because of dictation. So
it's always garbled. And then I look at it and I'm like, what?
Exactly.
We have one more question. I think we have time. This is probably the last one. Rebecca said, I would love to hear about how you complete a book from someone who's been working for a long time, many drafts, and also writes long. So how do you get to the end?
It depends on which end it is, right? So just like you said, Jillian, sometimes you think I'm done. Yeah. And then it's not at all true. And I think it's almost never true. The being done the first time is the first hurdle. And when I finished Anticipation, I didn't know it was coming. I think this happens a lot. I had a feeling I was almost there, kind of like driving in a snowstorm. And then suddenly I saw it, and then I wrote something, and then I realized I had finished the first draft, and I stood up from my desk. I was at my desk. Amazing.
You're at your desk.
And I started crying. I just out of sheer relief and shock. And of course, I edited it absolutely viciously for a year after that, and ripping it apart and writing new things. So I think it helps to know when it's done by having other people read it, either professional editors or others. If you can't see it anymore, sometimes it helps to know. I think no book is ever done either, right? In a way, you could go on forever. So to some degree, whether it's done or not depends on what you want to happen to it. And who's involved in that process. So there's, like a business aspect to it. And then there's psychic aspect, when you think you're done and you really can't go back to it, what I think some people do, although I haven't had the luxury to do this with, certainly not with anticipation, is leave it alone for a while and then come back and say, am I really done, or is there something I need to do?
I think for me, it's like sitting down every day and writing and moving forward. And then I get to this point where it's like, I know I'm getting close to the end, but I often don't know that until I'm right there. And I
Okay.
have this feeling like every day when I'm writing, like this is never going to end. I'm never going to finish this draft. And it's just kind of like sitting there every day and writing more until I hit that point where I understand where it's going.
Yeah, same thing. And you may change that later, but that first ending, I think, is a crucial moment.
Yeah.
That's a great place to end this
Yes.
wonderful presentation. You both have been wonderful. Do either of you have any last words you want to say?
I just want to say thank you. This is so much fun. Jillian, it's amazing to see you. Liza, thank you so much for making this possible. It is a very lonely thing to launch a book during a pandemic. It's lonely enough writing anyway.
Yes.
And that moment at which you get to share it with everybody, it's really, really, it's a little like making some really fancy, beautiful toy and then just launching it off a cliff and it disappears. So it's really nice to have an ability to talk to other people.
Yeah, I know. And thank you for including me. I'm sorry you had to make this virtual, but I'm happy that I got to be involved. So thank
And
you.
maybe I'll see you in March at the book festival.
Yeah, let's hope.
That's my plan.
Well, this has been great, and I'm so glad that all of you in the audience could join us today. And we invite you to visit our website and sign up for our newsletter and not miss whatever's next. And keep writing. I'm anxious to see what both of you come up with next. This is exciting. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.